Hello everyone. Welcome to the Chapter 1 notes video where we're going to be introducing a lot of the terminology that we're going to use this semester in statistics. There are a few quotes and passages that you can read throughout these notes. They're supposed to inspire some thinking. They're supposed to be a little bit entertaining as well. But these little passages are good. So you can read them, but I don't want to spend too much time just talking over these notes. I'd like to get to some of the math that's going to be taking place, especially in the later videos, but we'll have a little bit to fill in on these notes besides just looking at what definitions are already presented to us here. But in general, we want to introduce what statistics even is. And statistics, of course, you can see it here. It is a science that has to do with collecting, organizing, summarizing, and analyzing information. In general, this information, it's always going to be some data. We have not defined data yet. And the reason why we'd want to do this with some data is to be able to draw conclusions. If we're not able to draw conclusions from doing a study, then there was no point. It was a waste of time. It was a waste of money. And so that's why we want to be careful about the ways that we design experiments and take samples and stuff like that so that we'll be able to draw conclusions. And that's really our goal, is to learn about, in this case also to make claims about large groups that are difficult to study because they're so large, or perhaps we don't have access to all of the individuals that are in that group. So we want to be able to make predictions about the group, and we want to be able to make some claims by looking at the data just from some of its members. And so that small group of members that we're going to be looking at is what we're going to call a sample. And so you can see here these all go together, all of these definitions, which are that the population is the large group. The individual is just a member of the population, and then we take some set of members that we want to study and that we've selected randomly, hopefully, and we're going to call that group that we select our sample. And so we're going to be taking our sample and we're going to collect data from the sample, and the data are just the observations that we make. It's whatever we're going to measure about the sample or whatever we're going to notice about them. We might be observing their heights, their weights, we might be observing their occupations or something like that, and then we'll be able to make some claims. It all just depends on what we're trying to study. And that was the point of the goal of statistics, is that we need to come up with some type of a process where we're going to be able to ensure that we can make some conclusions. And so we have a process outlined here, which is that we need to identify first the problem. That's always the thing in any type of a science, is that you need some sort of a hypothesis, or you need some motivation in order to conduct your study. And so we're going to come up with some objective that we're going to research. And then we need to collect the data. And the means of collecting the data is what we're going to be talking about a little bit in this chapter, because we want to make sure that those data are going to represent the population. Since we're only going to be taking data most of the time from a sample, that's where we have to be very careful. And then we're going to describe the data, and that's something that we can describe using graphs that we're going to see coming up. We can have graphs and charts, that kind of thing, or else we can describe the data more numerically. We can come up with some things like mean, median, mode, range, that kind of stuff if they are numerical data. And we can organize it, we can write about it, and then we can perform an inference, which is, an inference is another way of saying kind of a prediction, which is where we can basically take our descriptions of the data and we can say whether or not we feel comfortable applying it to the population, or if we have some type of an error that we expect, some margin of error. And then our statistics, we can break them up into a couple of different things. And this is also sort of in line with the process, that this describing the data, that's where we're going to be using all of these kinds of descriptive statistics, which is where we are organizing and summarizing the data, organizing into graphs, summarizing by means of numerical summaries such as mean, standard deviation, that kind of stuff, like I said before. And then the inferential statistics is where we're going to be able to take whatever we learned from the sample and apply it to the population. Then we have here a couple of very important words that we will define. The parameter, the way that I always remember the difference between these, see, a parameter, it's a numerical summary of a population, And notice parameter and population, they both start with P. So parameter and population go together. And we use some special symbols for these. For example, the average value for a population we call mu, which this is the Greek letter M. It goes mu, and it's pronounced like an M, and it stands for mean, because of course mean and mu, they both start with the M. They both go m. And then we also have, for example, the sigma here. Lowercase sigma also starts with S, and so it goes S, and S and standard deviation go together. And so there's kind of a convention that whenever we do the parameters for the population, we end up using some Greek symbols for that, like mu and sigma. And then the corresponding values that the corresponding symbols that we use for the statistic, where the statistic is just the number that goes with the sample, and they both start with S, statistic and sample. The average for this one, this one is called X bar. And the idea here is that we use Roman letters for the statistics, where we used Greek letters for the parameters. And then the standard deviation is very anticlimactic. We just call lowercase s. And then we can see a couple of examples here. Suppose that the percentage of all the students on the campus who have a job is 84.9%. And we're assuming that that's the population, all the students. And so that means that this proportion here, and that's what we would call it, anytime there's a percentage, we would call a proportion. That's the name of the parameter. It's the proportion. Just like we have means and we have standard deviations, we also have proportions, and that's something that we're going to deal with. That's a parameter because it had to do with the population, all the students. But then if we take a sample just of 250 of those students, there's a sample here, and 86.4% have a job, then this proportion right here, it's also a proportion, but in this case it is a statistic because it had to do with the sample. And then we can take a look at a couple of these other examples right here. A certain zoo found that 8% of its 843 animals were nocturnal. Here we don't have much context to be able to tell, what this study would be about. I guess if this zoo is just trying to make some claims about the animals that live at the zoo, then this is just all of the animals. This is all of them. So that's the whole population. And since it's the whole population, that means that this 8%, which is a proportion for this one, it's going to be a parameter. And then, for the next example, telephone interviews of 1502 adults found that 69% of them could identify the current vice president. Now here, the study is probably trying to measure how many of all of the adults in the whole United States or in whichever country could identify the current vice president. And so here this is just going to be a sample of the whole population. Here this one is a sample. And so that means that this proportion is what should it be? Statistic, because statistic and sample both go so. And so we can define a few more terms here. Parameter versus statistic. It's pretty straightforward. But now we're going to get into this idea of variables. Variables are what we're going to be measuring, basically. This is very similar to the idea of data. The data are basically the variables that we measure. We decide which variables we want to measure based on what we're trying to study, and then as we measure those variables for each individual, all of those measurements are called the data. And the variables themselves are which characteristics we're trying to measure. And so a variable could, example, be the height. And then once we take an individual and we measure its height, then that measurement there is going to be the data. And so we have a way that we can break up the variables into two different types. We have the qualitative variables and we have quantitative. Qualitative sounds like quality. It has to do with basically some type of categories. These can be things, usually the way whenever you measure them, they'll be words, but in general, they're just ways that we can categorize things. So by, for example, gender, color, model, zip codes, you could have stuff like that. Quantitative ones sounds like quantity, and those are going to be all of the types of numerical measurements. Notice here we could have something like zip code that actually is numerical, but really a zip code is just a way of categorizing locations, whereas numerical measurements, numerical types of variables like heights, weights, number of students in a class, we could actually do some type of meaningful arithmetic with these. We can compare them, which one's larger, which one's smaller, and stuff like that. You want to do it with zip codes. It doesn't, if one zip code's numerically larger than another one, it doesn't tell you anything. And so we can take here the quantitative variables, and we can actually break those down into two other types, where we can have a discrete variable, and the discrete variables are the amounts that can be counted. And so a lot of times those can be whole numbers. It doesn't have to be whole numbers, especially thinking about points. You know, there are sports where the points that you score are not necessarily whole numbers. I'm thinking about some of the shooting sports like the archeries and stuff like that, where in particular, I think the air rifle, you could look it up, the air rifle in the Olympics, they have decimal scores, but still you can count the amounts that are possible, because even though the amounts might go 10.1, 10.2, 10.3, something like this, if these are all the three different possibilities that somebody could have gotten, then we can still count them. It's just that this decimal, it's here instead of being in between the ones place and the tenths place. The idea with a continuous variable is these are amounts, instead of being able to count them, they're amounts that should be measured. And so we're going to use some types of scientific instruments like thermometers to measure temperature and scales to measure weight. And the accuracy of these variables, how many decimals they will contain, for example, are just dependent on the quality of the instrument. But here it's not possible to enumerate what are the measurements that are possible to get for our data. And hopefully by looking at some of these examples, it will be abundantly clear the difference between discrete and continuous. And then, like I was saying before, there's a subtle difference between variable and data, which is that a variable, and then like I was saying before, the difference between variable and data is that the variable is the actual, I guess you could say, the name of what we're trying to measure. For example, we might be taking measurements of the gender of individuals. The actual observations that we make, like whether an individual is male or female, those will be the data. And so if you think about it, you could come up with a list. You could say we're trying to measure gender, and then we're going to just start listing, and we got a male, and then a female, then another female, then a male, then another male, then another male, something like this. Here goes the variable is the gender, and then the data are the actual collection of measurements that we come up with. And now we'll see some examples where we will try to tell the difference between qualitative versus quantitative. The nationality of a parent, it should be clear the nationality has nothing to do with numbers, so this should be qualitative. And then the number of children in a household, this one, it's a number, and this number should be meaningful because you can do something with the numbers of children in a household. You can compare them. So for sure it's quantitative. And then to tell discrete versus continuous, you have to ask yourself, is this something that you count or is it something that you measure? And of course, a number of children in a household, you just count them like 1, 2, 3. And so this one is discrete. And then the household income in the previous year, it's still, this is a meaningful number that we can do some arithmetic with, so it should be quantitative. And then whether it is discrete or continuous, this one is going to have to do with whether this value is counted. The way that I'm imagining this one is that the income, it has to do with your money, and you could imagine you've got a big stack of money there and you would sit there and count it. You know, in household income, I think it's normally in whole dollars anyways, but this is something that can be counted. You know, and even if we go down to cents, we don't break down money any further than cents. So 2 decimal places would be the most possible, and so this would still be counted, which means that this should be a discrete variable. And then class rank, like freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, even though we can still compare these should be qualitative. And we'll get into this idea of what it means that you can compare sometimes qualitative data, like you can tell that freshman comes before sophomore, which comes before junior, which comes before senior. So you can put them in order, even though they are just categories. And then we've got daily intake of whole grains, measured in grams per day. It's just given away to us here. Since it's being measured, it should be quantitative. And in particular, the measured part is how we tell that it's a continuous one, because it's being measured. And then the temperature outside, at the start of the school day. It's also going to be a measured value, and it's going to be numerical, of course, so it should be quantitative, and it will be continuous. And I'm going to break this video off here. We will get into sections 1.3 and 1.4 in the next video. And so thank you guys for watching.